Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. This is the second part to my worst Byzantine emperors video. If you wish to know which emperors I thought to be the worst from 10 to 6, watch the first part. I have provided a link in the description below. Now, without further ado, here are the last 5 worst Byzantine emperors. Number 5. Andronicus I Komnenos. Ruling from 1083 to 1085, Andronicus I Komnenos was a tyrant, a murderer, and his cruelty eventually saw the overthrow of the Komnenian dynasty which had ruled for over a century. He was the opponent to everything his cousin Manuel had stood for. His rebellion resulted in the massacre of the Latins of Constantinople and the subsequent retaliatory action, leading to the deaths of thousands. He got his nephew, Alexis II, to execute his own mother, and then Andronicus murdered Alexios. He also probably murdered his niece, Maria Porphyrogenita, and her husband. The Hungarians penetrated the Danube frontier. The Serbs ceased paying tribute to the Romans. Cyprus was occupied and became independent under Isaac Comnenus in 1084, and eventually lost forever to the empire when Richard the Lionheart conquered the island during the Third Crusade. Andronicus did issue reforms to try and clear up the corruption of the leading aristocracy, which had occurred under Manuel, but their effect varied. His anti-aristocratic stance turned into a bloody persecution. He was distracted from maintaining the fragile frontiers which had faltered under Alexios II. In 1085, the Normans launched a massive invasion of Greece and sacked Thessalonica. Andronicus failed to deal with this crisis, and with the revolt of Isaac Angelos, he was brutally killed by a Constantinopolitan mob. His grandsons, Alexios and David, would continue the dynasty with their establishment of the Empire of Trebizond in 1204. His was a reign of blood, produced by the thousands that died during his reign. His death was a small justice. Number 4. Michael VII Ducas. Ruling for 7 years from 1071 to 1078, Michael VII was a terrible emperor. What catastrophe shall I name first? The source of his nickname, minus a quarter, which saw the debasement of the coin content of the nomisma from 70% to 57%, making the money worth a quarter what it was, while the price of grain rose, leading to famine in the capital? Was it the civil war with Romanus IV, whom Michael had blinded and exiled, which in the meantime allowed the Seljuk Turks to pour into Anatolia through the gap left in their defences after the Battle of Manzikert? Was it his ill decision to hand over the lands that Alexios Komnenos had won from Russell Baliol in central Anatolia, or the incalculable injustices of Nicephorezes the eunuch, who effectively took control of the empire from the weak and indifferent Michael VII? Michael did, however, manage to suppress a serious Bulgarian revolt. However, he was so unpopular by 1078 that both Nicephorus Bryennius the Elder and Nicephorus Botaniates rebelled against him. His reign was one of misery for his people, for his mother who he exiled, and even for his closest associates such as Michael Psellos, whom he eventually turned against due to the poisons uttered by Nicephorezes. Number 3. John V Palaeologus. John V, who ruled for 38 years from 1341 to 1347, 1354 to 1371, 1379 to 1390, and from 1390 to 1391, unlike many of the people on this list, John V was a good man, But his soft, weak, and ineffective rule saw the empire go from being still a local power to almost complete collapse by the end of the century, little more than a city-state. The period was marked by two unrelenting civil wars, the Black Death and John V's total failure to deal with the problems he faced or capitalise on his successes. The reign of his very competent son, Manuel II, shows what could be accomplished even in these straitened circumstances with someone who knew what they were doing at the helm. John eventually died a broken man in 1391 after a lifetime of failure and humiliation, his own son Andronicus IV and grandson John VII having rebelled against him. John V, therefore, is, in my opinion, the prime example of a Byzantine emperor who, though a good person, was utterly useless as a ruler, and thus his empire and people suffered a myriad of disasters because of it. Number 2. Phocas. Ruling from 602 to 610, Phocas was the archetypal tyrant. Phocas's bloody coup against Maurice destabilised the empire, gave cause for the Persians to begin their total war against the empire, and instituted a reign of terror. He massacred Maurice's family and spent much of his time purging potential enemies and rooting out conspiracies against him. Many died. Throughout the empire, people resisted and resented his tyranny. For instance, he fooled the master of the soldiers of the East into coming to Constantinople and then burned him alive because he defected to the Persians. Phocas's focus was thus focused on fighting internal threats to his rule rather than easing the relentless pressure on the frontiers. The Avars and Slavs burst through the defences on the Danube and occupied the Balkans, where thousands died or were enslaved. Khosrow II led the Persians to victory in Syria. By the end of his reign, the Persians had reached as far as the Bosphorus. In Italy, nothing was done to contain the Lombards, who continually pushed against Roman territory. Phocas replaced the people he purged from office with his friends and relatives, regardless of their skill. The only qualification was whether they supported him or not. He forced through unpopular reforms and dealt with any opposition to him. The tyranny of Phocas was so total that his own son-in-law, Priscus, plotted with Heraclius the Elder, Exarch of Africa, to rebel against Phocas. Bloody civil war broke out between the partisans of Phocas and Heraclius in Egypt, and Heraclius the Younger was able to capture and execute Phocas. Though ruling for 8 years, the irreparable damage done to the empire by Phocas had led, and would lead, to the deaths of thousands, and left Heraclius to fight a bitter war with both the Avars and Persia, leaving the empire completely gutted of resources. Number 1. Alexis III Angelos. The brother of Isaac II, Alexis III ruled from 1195 to 1203. A vicious and heartless man who could stomach blinding his own brother to satisfy his ambitions. His reign, which to no stretch of the imagination can be described as a rule, made Isaac's look like an example of expert statesmanship. He cared not one whit for the pressing issues of the empire, and simply let his officials do whatever they wanted. Corruption ran rampant, and he was about as corrupt as the lot of them. He poured money like rivers into idle projects and sycophants that left the empire in such a state of bankruptcy that Alexius IV and Isaac II could not fulfill the fantastical promises they had made to the remaining members of the Fourth Crusade. The Bulgarians were left unchecked to rampage in Thrace and Macedonia. Local landowners looked to themselves as a source of protection, and thus various regions such as the Peloponnese, Anatolia and Trebizond became independent even before the Crusaders arrived. The Turks continued to advance in Anatolia, meeting only locally organised resistance. When the Crusaders finally arrived to place Alexius IV on the throne, Alexius III initially resisted, and then, after loading up a cart of treasure, fled to Thrace, abandoning his family in the capital. He married his daughter to Alexis V, but on the wedding night, during a bath, he stormed their room and blinded Mutsuphilus. He left the blind emperor to be captured by the Crusaders, who then executed him. After an episode with Boniface of Montferrat, king of Thessalonica, Alexius went east to Theodore I Lascaris, his son-in-law. After Theodore refused to hand over the imperial title to Alexios, Alexios I then asked the Seljuk Sultan Kaikhosru I to press his claim to the Empire of Nicaea, which nearly resulted in the defeat of Lascaris and the conquest of the frail Empire of Nicaea had Theodore not slain the Sultan and won the Battle of Antioch on the Meander. Alexios was exiled to a monastery, where in 1211, having nearly destroyed the empire, blinded and imprisoned his brother, Isaac, had indirectly been responsible for the death of Alexius V, his son-in-law, and almost brought about the destruction of Theodore I Lascaris' domain out of jealousy, finally died. Alexius III, Angelos, not only a vile man, had led his empire and people to the brink of ruin. For these reasons, I see Alexius III as the very worst Eastern Roman emperor. That has been my top 10 worst Byzantine emperors. Whether you agree or disagree, leave a comment, like and subscribe, and tell me which emperors would make your list for the very worst emperors of the Byzantine Empire. I have been your host, Daniel Maynard, and this has been Eastern Roman History.